Loops are super useful, but sometimes one loop isn't really enough. For example, let's think about printing out a multiplication table. Multiplication tables are tables in that typically they sort of have two dimensions to them. They have one number multiplied by a series of other numbers, filling out a grid-like pattern. We could certainly do that with a loop, but it means within that loop, I'm going to have to do some math so that I can have all of this grid-like pattern. Well, that seems like a lot of work, and especially if you can notice these inner statements have a very predictable pattern. Whenever you see something like that, sometimes you're going to want another for loop. Nested loops is simply the concept of when you place one loop inside of another. And really, they function just like regular loops. It's just sometimes you have to pay closer attention to when one finishes executing, because now you've got an exponential number of things that are going to happen. Let's look at some code. Here is a loop inside of another loop, and we typically think about the loops as rows versus columns. The outer for loop is usually going to be the number of rows, because I'm going to print a bunch of things within that row, and then at the end of my outer for loop, I'm going to have a println statement and hit enter and go to the next row down. So that means that my inner for loop sort of represents my columns. So if I run this code, here's my output. You can see I have my outer loop running from 0 up until 4, and that's my row number colon part being printed out. And then the inner for loop is repeating from 0 to 9. So within each row, I get the numbers 0 to 9, and I get that 5 times. You can write nested loops that have relationships between the different for loop variables. For example, we can make the inner for loop depend on whatever the current state of I is, and it just treats it like a regular variable. This means we're going to print out a different number of stars on each individual line. So the output of a nested for loop structure like this is a nice little sort of pyramid shape. What happens is the outer for loop starts I at 1. So the inner for loop is going to run from 0 to 1. So it's going to print 1 star. Then we hit the println, we go to the next line, and I becomes 2, so the inner loop runs 2 times, then 3 times, then 4 times. Once you get nested loops, things can get a little confusing. The most common errors are mixing up whether you're talking about I or whether you're talking about J, whether you're talking about the outer for loop variable or you're talking about the inner for loop variable. This is an incredibly common mistake where you have I as in the outer for loop, and really you meant to make the inner for loop be based on J, but you put I there instead. What's going to happen is this is going to run an infinite number of times because that test is always going to be true and we're never going to get a chance to update I. Another common one is when you update the wrong variable. So again, you use I in the inner for loop. Again, you get an infinite loop because this is going to run and update I in that inner for loop and never get to the outer for loop test to actually stop the code from running. So sometimes, even though traditionally we use I as the outer for loop variable and J as the inner for loop variable, you might want to start by using some variable names to make it very clear, hey, this is my for loop variable for my outer one, this is my for loop variable for my inner one. Nested loops give you the power to print things in 2D structures. They also give you the power to get a lot more done within the context of a few lines of code. Essentially, if you think about it, a single for loop runs a linear amount of times. But nested for loops now run a quadratic number of times. For every single run of the outer for loop, you get some number of runs of the inner for loop. So they're really powerful, but keep in mind that sometimes you can end up running things a lot of times. So make sure you're always paying close attention to what your tests are and which for loop variables you're using and when.